Welcome to Rooting for You, a seasonal gardening podcast for non-experts. I'm Tess, and I know nothing.
And I'm Alyce, and I know some things.
Each week we'll chat about one gardening topic and then discuss the effort-reward payoff by asking, is the juice worth the squeeze? Just a heads up, there might be a bit of swearing in this episode. You've been warned. So this week's recording and the next few weeks actually might be a little bit different because Alyce and I are recording remotely. We are based in Melbourne and back in lockdown again. Now usually we're a couple of weeks ahead with podcast recording, but this week our stores have run out. And because we are coming into spring and we have so much to talk to you about, we didn't want to cut any episodes from our lineup. So here we are, trying to work out this recording remotely business and crossing our fingers and toes that it all goes to plan. If the recording isn't up to our usual standards, that's why, but please bear with us. We'll be back together soon, I'm sure. So, Alyce, how are you? Is there anything you wanted to add to the joys of remote recording before we get stuck into this?
No, I mean, we did talk long and hard about, whether we were going to do these episodes. And then I think we were both feeling pretty down. And then we had so many lovely listeners send us messages and comments on Instagram mainly, just saying how much they were enjoying the podcast. And it really just spurred us on in such a big way. So thank you to everyone that contacted us. And yeah, we're energized to crack on and keep bringing you content. And if there's ever a time to garden, it's coming into spring.
Yeah, now's
lockdown.
the time.
It really is.
So for today's episode, we're going to be talking about how to plan a spring garden. So pretty much everything you need to be thinking about before you start your spring planting. In preparation for our recording today, Alyce asked me to come up with a plan for my garden, and we're going to workshop it. So it's a little bit different to our usual format, but hopefully you can apply some of the same thinking to your own garden. So to start off with, I've started with a short list of the plants that I want to plant this season. But Alyce, first of all, let me tell you about the overarching principles that I've come up with in choosing my plants. The first one, back when I got started, you said to me, grow what you want to eat, which I think is a really good guiding principle. So that's number one principle. And then the second principle that I'm working on is working on still growing my garden confidence. And ideally, I'd like more successes than fails this spring. So that's kind of where I'm at coming into my spring planting.
I think that makes total sense.
So you want me to hit with my list of things?
Yeah, hit me with your list. So do you want to just, for anyone that's new listening, Tess and I have done an introduction on our garden before, but do you want to just give people a really brief overview of how much space you're working with so they can kind of get an idea of where their garden compares space-wise?
Mm-hmm. So I've got two raised garden beds, and one of them I'll call the sunny garden bed, and one of them is a less sunny garden bed. Neither of them I don't think of full sun in spring. I still think that they're partly shaded throughout the day at different times of the day. They're probably like a metre squared or 2 metres squared all up of what my garden space is there.
I would have said, between 1.5 metres and 2 metres squared, each of them.
And then I have a couple of pots that I have herbs in, and then I've got a few of the fabric grow bags from the seed collection, which are, if anyone hasn't seen one before, it's made out of fabric, and it's just like a fabric pot, for want of a better description. And those you can move around like pots, and they're really great because they just create additional garden space for you. And I have a small, medium, and large of those.
Yeah, they're like the instant pop-up cheap garden bed.
Oh, yeah, that's exactly right. Dirt cheap.
Yeah.
They're really good.
And then you've got your garlic patch too.
Got my garlics. So they're just going to stay growing throughout spring, aren't they?
They are going to stay growing, but I did give some thought about that little area, and we'll talk about that later. But I thought it's important to include in your total
yes,
edible
I do have
space.
yes. And then I have my my orange tree, which is just going to keep doing its thing. And my lemon, which needs some love.
Okay, we're going to do a citrus episode one day soon, guys. Okay, so that is the full extent of your veggie garden growing space as of this spring. So, it's not a huge amount of space compared to some like myself, but nonetheless, it's still a really decent space to get a good harvest. Like I think, as you say, if you think carefully about what to grow to focus on some wins, you're going to be quite chuffed with how much food you can produce in that small space.
And also that, I'm doing both growing in garden beds, but also some pots as well. So for people listening who have less space, and balconies as well. So there'll be something here for you too.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are you thinking for your top produce picks?
So things that I want to eat. I really want to eat strawberries that I grow myself. So that's the number one thing on my list. I also have cucumbers. I have a few seeds from the seed collection that I'm really keen to get in the ground. So that's my sugar snap peas and silverbeet. Potatoes, mostly because I've been swayed by, we've had a number of requests come in from listeners for potatoes, so I'm swayed by the masses.
Yeah, people want potatoes. They're so easy and so much fun to grow. You know how much I'm busting to talk about potatoes.
Flowers, to get the bees into my garden to pollinate my plants.
That's actually not as long as I thought it would be. I was expecting you to put like crazy things like watermelons and things like that on there. So I think you've been quite restrained.
Can you imagine? Maybe I should grow a watermelon.
No, not this year. Not this year. I'm impressed. That's a pretty good list for your garden. And it's not particularly different to what I had picked out for your garden as well. So maybe we should talk about let's talk about each of your growing spaces first. Let's talk about your sunnier plot.
Okay, so what should we be thinking about for the sunnier spot in everyone's gardens?
Well, I think you're right. Zucchinis, I get they're not the sexiest vegetable, but they are just so prolific in a very small space that if you want a garden win and, as far as like energy levels to food production, cost of the whole growing exercise to the amount of food you're going to get, like zucchinis are brilliant. So I think you should get one of them in.
Can I put a zucchini in like one of the big fabric grow bags?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
The larger one, definitely. Now, if you really liked zucchini, like say you're my mum who just like thinks zucchini is a great vegetable, I'm not in that camp either, but I would grow something like a black beauty because that is like a really reliable zucchini that's very similar to the ones you get in the supermarket. But if for someone like you that's like a bit less excited about the old zucchini, what you could do to try and make the process a bit more fun is grow one of the more unusual varieties. So like a golden zucchini, which is yellow or things like that. So then it's like you get the prolificness of the zucchini and the easiness, but you get a bit of creativity with it above and beyond heaps of black zucchinis. So there's heaps, like I always say, there's so many different types of zucchini. So you could check that out. And I find actually, the Black Beauty is incredibly prolific, incredibly easy, but the rest of them aren't, particularly hard or less prolific. So I would say that is one where you could get creative with the varieties. So I think the zucchini's in. Okay, unless you really hated it, we're going to stick with it.
No, I'm desperately keen for a bit of a confidence boost. So zucchinis are in.
You'll love that one. And, zucchinis are really easy to grow from seed. So that would be one that I would probably grow from seed. And then again, you get that added benefit of the varieties of, the different types, that kind of thing. So
and
I will go.
Something that we were talking about in the planting from seed episode was I've forgotten the name of them. They're like the little Hesham tubs that you can plant it in and then plant it straight in the ground.
Oh, the biodegradable pots. Yeah. Zucchinis are bang on. I actually sent you a photo this week, Tess, which I'm sure you're going to put on Instagram, of one of my zucchinis in one of those biodegradable pots. They're perfect for that.
Awesome.
Highly recommend. I will actually, I'll as we're going through this list, I will say whether I'd grow from seed or seedling, in my opinion. Like obviously you can do all from one or from the other, but there are some that I would say, worth going and buying the seedling, and some I'd say go from seed. Zucchini, we're going to stick with the seed. So for you, Tess, I would get some biodegradable pots and get your zucchini in your little greenhouse, which I know you're keen to set up. That would be one. And you could do that tomorrow, literally.
Fabulous. Perfect lockdown weekend activity.
Exactly. And this is like the end of the last couple of weeks of winter.
So sunny spot for zucchinis, what are we talking about in terms of water for them? I mean, I don't have an irrigation system set up, so I'll be out there with my hose. But are they water guzzlers?
Look, anything edible is often a water guzzler, and things that are fruiting, so, tomatoes, zucchinis, cucumbers, they're all fruiting, they're even more of a water guzzler. So they are going to be heavy on the water. I wouldn't say more than anything else. But yeah, no, your veggie garden's not the one to let dry out. Having said that, though, they're probably not the heaviest. They're not a pumpkin, for example. So yeah, again, keep it moist in spring, possibly less of an issue. We've still got quite a bit of rain and it's not as warm, but in summer you will need to attend to that patch. And being a raised garden bed, they actually do dry out a bit faster than something in the ground. So that's just something else to be mindful of. I'm all about raised garden beds. I think they're brilliant, and your setup is brilliant, but it does just mean it'll need a little bit more attention with the hose.
Okay, great.
We can do a whole episode on watering systems one day. Okay, zucchinis are in. Next off, tomatoes. Now, you know how much of a fan I am of tomatoes for beginners. Now, I will say anything that's a fruiting vegetable, so again, tomatoes, zucchinis, cucumbers, beans, these are always a little bit harder. The easiest crops always for beginner gardeners are what's called your leaf vegetables, your leafy greens. They're always going to be the easiest. As soon as we're talking fruiting, it does get a little bit harder, but I do think tomatoes still fit in that category that a beginner gardener can absolutely nail, get some good rewards, and as you say, have that confidence boost and have that win. And I mean, everyone loves tomatoes, right? So
absolutely.
These need full sun. That's the first thing. Now, you tried to grow these last year and didn't have success. That was really due to the fact you got them in too late. So we're at the end of winter, coming into spring in a couple of weeks. This is the time you need to be thinking about your tomatoes. If you get frosts, you have to wait till the last frost is passed. But as soon as that's happened, get those tomatoes in the ground. The earlier you get them in, the more time they're going to have in that warm weather and the more tomatoes you're going to have. As simple as that.
One thing that I worry that I fell foul of last year was also putting in too many.
Yeah, you didn't space them right. That was the other thing, although I don't think that was your biggest failing. But if you put in...
Don't hold back.
Look, we want other people to learn from your mistakes so they don't make the same ones,
of course.
Right? So if you'd put in all 5 of those tomatoes, I think it was 5, that close together in spring, come the start of autumn, like that garden bed just would have been an absolute mess. They would have been too crowded. So the only reason that didn't happen is because, again, they weren't in long enough. But yeah, read the punnet or the packet, depending whether you're going from seed or seedling, and space them accordingly because they do turn into monsters. Like you'd be surprised when you give them enough water, enough food, enough space, and you get them in early, how huge tomato plants can get. Like I'm talking like all of mine would easily get to 2 meters taller. So
yeah, that's something really to think about.
It is. And as much as I'm always for like pressing the borders of like, they said a meter, let's stick them in 80 centimeters next to each other. Like you can kind of fudge it a little bit, but I mean, you can't put them 30 centimeters and think that every plant's going to be able to thrive. Now, tomatoes would be one that I would say I'm not opposed to buying the old seedling. This is for a couple of reasons. One, as I said, the earlier you get it in, the more fruit you're going to get, and that's obviously a win. 2, they're probably the only thing at the nursery that you actually get a really good variety of types. So if you want to grow yellow ones, pear-shaped ones, cherry ones, massive sauce tomatoes, Black Russians, whatever it is you want to grow in the tomato department, you can usually get a seedling of that variety. And I think because everyone loves growing tomatoes so much, you go to any nursery and I reckon half the stock they've got at this time of year is tomatoes. So, for $3 or $4, I would say it's worth it to get that head start and to get that strong seedling from the get-go. Having said that, if you've got seeds, 100% grow them from seeds, but I do think the seedling's an easy win with the tomatoes. And they need the full sun. So they're going to go in the sunniest spot you've got.
Okay.
Now, one plant will give quite a lot of tomatoes. So, you know, even if someone only had room for one, I would say they're going to be very happy with that. But I'd say for you, maybe two, and then grow two different varieties. I
Oh, yeah,
find,
good one.
yeah, and I find the cherry tomatoes to be easier. I don't know if that's just my experience or everyone's, but I would say if you're only growing one or maybe two, I'd probably go with the smaller varieties. So again, just to try and, you know, maximize our chances of success as a beginner here. And
Okay, great.
in the cherries, there are, you know, a billion varieties. So we've got plenty of options. Okay, we've got two in. Third thing, and you mentioned this, and I think you bang on, cucumbers. So the cucumbers are quite easy to grow in the warm weather. As soon as if you get any cold snaps, they're not going to be happy. But the reason I like these, also everyone loves eating cucumbers, is what we can do, and this will be particularly good in your garden with your raised beds, is we can grow these around the outside of the bed. And because they're trailing plants, they kind of look like vines, you can actually train them to kind of grow and overflow the bed, kind of coming out of the garden
that's cool.
bed. Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah, it's just a way to kind of maximize the space and kind of utilize the fact that you've got that kind of wall of the garden bed, and they're small enough that they'll just hang down the front and the cucumbers will grow off that. And actually, because your raised garden bed's a stone, those stones will warm up quite beautifully, and the cucumber plant, I actually think, will enjoy kind of resting against that heat source and kind of be a bit protected from wind and things like that. So I
very
would get
nice.
I'd get some cucumbers in around the outside. Now, these are quite easy to grow from seed, and you'll get heaps of varieties, so I'd probably do that. Having said that, I'm not opposed to a cucumber seedling either, so either or, depending on your timing. The other thing you actually can get, going back to the zucchini, is you can get a couple of varieties of zucchini. I'm thinking of one, Tromicino, that also has that vining aspect. So if you didn't have room in the main garden bed or the middle of it, you could actually trail a zucchini down the side of your garden bed as well.
Yeah, that's
But
definitely not something I thought of before. That's a great idea.
yeah, so with the zucchinis, it will depend on the variety, but with the cucumbers, it's a guaranteed certainty that, yeah, they'll trail and they'll go like that. The other thing you could do, I do think your garden's slightly smaller, but if you were obsessed with this ingredient, I would say give it a crack, is a pumpkin. Now, I'm not talking the old butternut pumpkin here, like you do not have room for that, but you can get quite a few mini varieties of pumpkins that are really beautiful flavour and kind of like a small cute shape, which I don't hate because it's kind of like a meal's worth for two people of pumpkin.
Oh, yeah.
And again, they trail just like the cucumbers do, so you could be trailing those off the edge of your garden bed, kind of around the area. So that's your other option there. But I would say probably the cucumbers would be my pick over the pumpkins. And you're going to get cucumbers a lot faster, which is another win.
I love a quick win. So
We do, because the other thing is, like, we don't want to plant everything that's not going to be ready until autumn, you know what I mean? Like, some of the bigger pumpkins will take that long, so we want to get some wins early. The next thing I go with, which you didn't mention, I don't think, is beans. So, like your green beans, your purple beans, that kind of thing, your bologna beans.
no,
Have these-
tell me about them.
Well, they're really easy to grow. They're really easy to grow from seed. And there's two types. There's the bush beans, which just grow like little plants, kind of like a chili plant, or there's a climbing bean. So if you had, like, I'm thinking at the back of your garden bed, you've kind of got a fence with like a trellis thing. So you could grow beans along the back of the fence and they'll grow up that wall and then provide you with beans. So if you've got some kind of climbing space, the climbing beans are a really good option as well. And they like the sun. I mean, if you don't eat beans, it's probably less appealing. But there are some really interesting colours. Like, obviously, there's the green beans we know in the supermarket, but purple beans I often grow. There's heaps of different varieties of purple ones, and also like a waxy yellow colour, which people sometimes know for beans. So again, creative varieties there. And yeah, good for fences, good for trellising. The last...
It's definitely thinking about the use of your space. Is just when we were talking about the cucumbers and now the beans as well, and things going up and down. I hadn't really thought about that, and that's definitely when you're looking at your space to like maximize the use of sunshine and space. Yeah, that's really, really creative thinking. I like it.
I think it was one of my gardening teacher a few years ago, like I think this sums it up. He was like, you have to think of your garden in 3D, not 2D, which makes total sense. As you said that, I was just thinking you could also grow your cucumbers or your trailing zucchini, that kind of thing, against the back fence and use that trellis that way as well, and then train those up the back wall. So beans aren't the only option. As much as you can train things to go down, you can also train them to go up.
Amazing.
So that could be an interesting thing. And they will get more sun, obviously, growing them up rather than down. So if sun was an issue, we might try and go north rather than south. But I do think cucumbers will be totally fine on the edge of your garden bed or on the edge of, everyone's raised garden bed. Okay, last thing I'd put in the full sun bed is a chili. So
excellent.
As you said,
don't put in 9 chilies all super close to each other.
Was it 9 you put in last year or 12?
Oh my God, it was so many. It was far too many. This was back when I didn't know that you had to separate all the different seeds from the punnet.
And how far we have come, my friend.
How far?
Now, I'd say 1 chili plant is going to be sufficient for most people. I like the chilies because I find them quite easy and they're kind of like, they're always there, whenever you're cooking something and you want a chili, there's always like a ripe chili on the plant for you. So, and they don't take up much space at all. Like I'm talking a small pot you can grow a chili in. So, even if you've got a balcony, I think a chili is, a pretty fun fruiting option for you. And of course, there's a billion types of chilies from really mild, kind of almost like a red pepper to, like your ghost chilies, which is super, super hot. Just pick something, like I'm more inclined to go with a milder one and adding more, especially because you're probably going to actually grow more chilies than what you need. Like you're going to have, say you got 20 on this plant at any one time. You're not using 20 at the time. So I'd say go a bit milder. That would be one I would buy from a seedling. Same reason as tomatoes. They have a really great variety at nurseries often. And secondly, the longer the growing season, the more chilies you're going to get. And thirdly, chili seeds actually need quite a warm temperature to germinate. So if you planted a zucchini today, I have no doubt in your garden test it would germinate and grow. I actually don't think a chili seed would. So by doing it at a nursery, they've done it in a heat-controlled environment and it's going to get that, warmth to germinate and kind of give you the head start. So that would be one I would purchase.
Okay. And let me know if I'm opening up a can of worms with this question, but could you do a chili like on a sunny windowsill inside?
Excellent question. I have grown chilies inside. Yes, you absolutely can. No problem at all. With a good sunny window, you will get a really productive plant. So yes, even if you don't have a garden, guys, you can grow a chili.
Okay, so that's everything for the super sunny bed.
That's everything for the super sunny bed. Now, the other thing I'd like you to put in some, but I'm not going to put it in the super sunny bed, is the old potatoes. These are so easy, so much fun, so prolific, and you can get one of those potato sacks. I think we've talked about them before. And grow the potatoes in that so you're not taking up any of your kind of precious garden bed space. So for you, Tess, you could get a potato sack and just sit it against your raised garden bed and grow a few potatoes in that and you'll get like quite a few kilos.
You are blowing my mind with this. I don't think we've spoke about this potato sack before.
We haven't. Okay, we're going to stop because I said to you the other day, like one of the next episodes I want to do is growing potatoes because it's such a good introduction for beginners. So I think everyone needs to include that on their spring list. If you've got a huge garden like mine, obviously you're going to grow in a garden bed and it is better growing in a garden bed. But for anyone on a smaller space or really wanting to maximize it, the potato sacks are brilliant. So
okay, well then let's put that on the agenda.
But put them on your plan.
Coming soon.
Exactly. Now, for a less sunny spot, so for your kind of shadier garden bed and for anyone that has, a growing patch with less sun, what we're going to focus on here are the leaves and the roots. So again, it's the fruiting plants that are most dependent on the sun, most dependent on the water, kind of need the most attention. The roots and the leaves are easier and they can tolerate less sun. So that's what's going to go in this bed.
Okay.
Now, a lot of these we've actually talked about before. So we've got lettuce, rocket, radishes, brilliant. Swiss chard / silverbeet, they're the same thing. That's excellent veggie for beginners to grow. It is so prolific, so easy. You can grow it from seed, no problems. And it's actually what's called a biannual, which I won't bother explaining, but the summary of that is it will be there 2 years later. So unlike your tomatoes and your zucchinis that are going to die in 9 months' time, your Swiss chard or your Silverbeet will still hang around for quite a few seasons. So it's like minimal effort to get it in the ground and then the gift that keeps on giving. Obviously, you have to want to eat it, which I think is what puts people off. I would, like, the way I use it is just like whatever I'm cooking, like a curry, a pasta sauce, you know, a ragu, anything, like a soup, a minestrone soup. I just thinly slice it and chuck it in at the end and it just wilts down and it's like, super nutrition. So I grow that. If you wanted to get creative and you had a little bit more space, I would try the beetroot as a root vegetable that we haven't talked about. Again, if you don't love beetroot, don't bother. The other reason I love the beetroots is you can eat the beetroot heads, like the leaves that come up, kind of like you eat Silverbeet, you know what I mean? Like you can actually harvest them as you're going and cut them up and put them in your minestrone soup. So it's kind of like 2 crops in one, which I find quite handy. Have I got any takers?
I love beetroot, so you 100% would have a taker in me. Space obviously is my concern.
Space is the concern, yeah. So, you know, it might be a smaller crop of them. Again, growing from seed, really brilliant. And there's so many good colours. Like it's not just the purple ones, you know, it's like pink and yellow and striped. And there's like white ones with pink circles around them, which I can't pronounce their name. It's some Italian word, but they look really beautiful. So that's got a few options. The other thing that I think is good is spring onions. Because these need a tiny spot. You can grow these in a tiny pot as well. So again, if balcony is your thing, tiny pot of spring onions. I'm talking like, 15 centimetres squared or something like that, maybe 20 centimetres squared. Like you could get enough of a crop of spring onions. What you do is when you harvest them, instead of pulling them out at the roots, like when you buy a bunch of them, you can actually just cut it off at soil level and it will continue to grow. So then you cut it off, you eat it, and then, a few weeks later you get another spring onion there. So it's a nice cut and come again.
We're talking about spring onions and not chives. I sometimes get confused between the two.
Yeah, similar family. No, we're talking about spring onions. Like how you buy a bunch and they've got like the white ends with the little hairy roots and like the long green bits.
They're like 30 centimetres long.
Yeah, exactly. And I find also like when you're cooking, you only use 1 or 2 at a time and you've bought a whole bunch, so it's not particularly economical.
Well, that's good. I think that sounds like an absolute win for me. I'll add that to my list for sure.
I think any little corner of a garden bed, unless someone was like, off the onion and garlic because they're FODMAPs or whatever, I would say, unless you're that person, like a tiny patch of spring onions, a tiny pot of spring onions is going to go a long way. Now, the one thing I'm going to put in here, which I think is a little bit harder, but it is so good to have this in the garden that we're gonna give it a crack anyway as beginners, and that's basil. So basil,
brilliant.
Like what does basil not go beautifully in? I don't know. And, just being able to pick a couple of leaves to put in a salad or on top of your pasta or whatever, I just love having it on hand as opposed to, buying a whole bunch and it doesn't stay fresh for very long. So that one, again, we could put it in with our full sun and with our tomatoes. They're a nice companion planting situation, which we can talk about more detail in another episode. But I think if space is really of a premium in this situation, I would put the basil in a shadier spot because it will be fine there. And happy to grow from seed or happy to grow from a seedling, either would be good. And that's kind of like your cut and come again as well. Like you just harvest a few leaves or a few kind of shoots and then it will come back and, keep giving you goodness. And then lastly in that shadier bed would be the nasturtiums. So these are a flower that we've talked about a few times because I'm a really big fan. They're great for beneficial insects. They're great for bees. The flowers are edible and they're pretty. And the leaves are also edible. So, it's not just for the aesthetics. Like it's actually a full food crop. And it is so easy to grow from seed. It's actually may turn into a weed in your garden. So whack a couple of seeds in and they will do really, really well. And it's actually really hardy. Like you can hack at it. You could think that you've killed it and you haven't even killed it. So it's quite a good one to add in there and it will tolerate that shadier spot as well. So I don't do like a bed of nasturtiums. I kind of just plant, one or two in the corners of a few beds and kind of let them take off that way. And they kind of trail as well. So they kind of trail down the front of the garden beds, kind of like we were talking about earlier. So that's another really good option for raised garden beds and just to kind of make full use of the space you've got. They come in heaps of fun colours. Yellow is the most conventional, but I quite like the deep purples and the salmons and the pinky colours as well.
Very nice.
So that would be the shadier list. Now, your garlic bed we can talk about on another episode because I'm just thinking we're running out of time. But it's an interesting spot, the garlic, because when you think about it, it's going to come out of the ground November or December, which is an unusual time to be planting. So what we may choose to plant there, we probably don't want to plant a tomato there because we wanted to get the tomatoes in really early. But something like kale or your favourite, Tess, Brussels sprouts, might actually time perfectly with the kale coming out. So when we talk about those brassica crops, that might be the time to do it, November and December. Now, two other things you mentioned, ginger and turmeric. These are really easy to grow and, really as long as you've got some warmth to you, which, in Melbourne, even in cold Melbourne, we do, you can grow them really successfully. The trick is for you and for most people, grow them in a separate pot. So I wouldn't put them in any of the garden beds you've got going now, but I would definitely give them a go in a smaller pot. And actually those grow bags would be brilliant.
Yeah, it could be a great idea.
Yeah, for the ginger and turmeric as well. And we should do a whole episode on those because they're a bit different in how they grow, but they are very easy. And given the price of ginger and turmeric, I would say a really, as far as a money saving option goes, that's absolutely going to be top on there. And I love fresh ginger. Like the ginger you get at the supermarket, it's like dry and old and horrible. Like fresh ginger with that like soft skin that you can just peel off with a spoon. Like that is just the best. And one of the only ways to get it is to grow it yourself. Now,
it's also it falls into my category of just really fun ones to have.
yeah, definitely. And look, it does take a long time. Like you'd plant it now and you're probably not going to harvest it until almost the beginning of winter next year. So it is a long one, but it kind of, other than being watered, it's not demanding. So it's kind of like you have it in your pot and you just grow it, water it, and just forget about it until
and that's kind of
year.
why the grow bags could be so good because you're not taking up other prime garden space.
Yeah, exactly. And the way that they grow, because they're like a root that kind of spreads under the ground as well, you kind of want them to be a bit contained, and you also don't want your tomato roots competing with them. You know what I mean? Because the root is actually what we want. So we have to give them prime root space to themselves. And I find a pot is usually the easiest way to do that. Not the only way. People grow it in the ground really successfully, but I do find pots better. So the other thing you mentioned was strawberries, and I do think that your garden and anyone's, small garden could be very much enriched with some strawberry plants. I would have them in pots. Okay. So we're going to have them separate. We're going to have them in pots. We're going to have them somewhere sunny. So even on the corner of your deck, Tess, could be a really good option. Now, strawberries are a bit different to veggies because they are, perennial. They're not going to die over winter. So that's why we give them their own kind of home in a pot and we can keep them going. Spring is the time that we would plant them as well. Now, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but they need their own episode. But the tip I will say is put them in a self-watering pot. It's really easy for them.
Okay.
It's really easy for them to dry out, and that's the last thing we want for juicy strawberries. And with small pots, because you only need a small pot for strawberries, they're really small plants. Being a small pot, the negative of that is that, again, it is easier for it to dry out. So by having a self-watering pot, that means that it just gives you a bit of buffer room and just kind of really make sure that those strawberries don't get too dry. So, yeah, the old small self-watering pot, $15 from your hardware store, and you could fit 3 little strawberry plants in them. The last thing I think you should grow in your garden, this is a bit more of an investment.
I think you said the last thing about 5 times.
Okay, this really is the last thing, is passion fruit.
Oh.
This is a vine that will be in the garden, in the spot for, 7 to 10 years. So it's not something we can add to this list of whack it in the veggie garden, whack it in your raised boxes situation. But spring is the time to plant it. So I think at your place, Tess, that could be one of the bigger fruit providing plants that we could go with. Like we've kind of, discarded fruit trees, but I think a passion fruit vine could work. So we'll come back to that, but I think that would be the other thing food-wise I'd be considering for you now. How does that sound? I really was finished.
So if I love it. If I can just kind of summarize where we've got to, we've covered off a bunch of stuff to put in for a kind of easy accessible crops for a sunny garden bed, easy accessible crops for a less sunny garden bed, and then also great ideas for pots.
Yeah.
And things like the fabric grow bag. So hopefully there is something in here for everyone, no matter what your space is, that hopefully we've inspired you to start planning out your garden beds for spring.
Yeah, and look, now's the time to really think about it, and especially if you're going to grow seeds in a greenhouse or inside, now's the time to do it, because the earlier you get all that stuff in the garden, the bigger the harvest you're going to have. So don't leave it too late. Yeah, crack on with it now. Let's do it.
So I don't reckon we do a squeezy juice matrix for this episode because we've covered so much ground.
I think we've done it. And obviously there's going to be a lot of questions people have on all the different crops we've talked about. So we will obviously go into more detail into each of them, like throughout the spring season.
Yeah, absolutely. What would be like your one top tip for someone planning their spring garden right now?
Look at the sun and plant the sunny stuff in the sunniest spots for success, and 2, get everything in as early as possible. That'd be my 2 tips.
Great one. And also grow what you want to eat.
And grow what you want to eat. Yeah, totally.
Rooting For You is hosted by Alyce and Tess. You can find us on Instagram @rootingforyoupod or email rootingforyou@alycealexandra.com.